Hey guys, it's Alyssa, the hopeless romantic redhead.
And I'm Danielle, the whodunit detective.
And welcome to Main Character Syndrome. If you feel like you are the main character in your life, you are in the right place. Danielle, it is finally October and spooky season.
I know, I am here living for it. Fall, my favorite season. Basic white girl right here.
Pumpkin spice lattes.
Love some pumpkin spice. Love Halloween.
Mhm.
I just love the feel of fall in the air. It has a little bit of romance to it, you know?
Speaking of romance, tell us about your main character moment.
Yes, my main character moment was I just got back from Italy with my husband for
Ooh.
10 days. I will say, while it sounds super romantic, and we definitely did have a lot of like very romantic, sweet moments traveling Italy together,
Mhm.
it was tiring.
Yeah.
We went to Milan, Venice, Florence, and Rome, and just went go, 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 doing everything that we could fit into the time we had there. Because I mean, you could just spend months and months there, and there's still so much more history to learn. But it was a great time, and that was definitely my main character moment.
Did you do a lot of touristy things?
Yes, my favorite thing, I'm obsessed with glass blowing
Okay.
and the show Blown Away on Netflix.
Yes, me too.
And Murano, which is an island off of Venice,
Mhm.
next to Venice, we took a boat there one afternoon and took a glass blowing class. I thought it was going to be like 4 to 6 people, but we get there and it actually turned out to be just like a private lesson with
Fun.
this glass master, like one of the most incredible glass blowers in the world. It's just a private lesson for my husband and I, and it was phenomenal.
That's definitely a main character moment.
Yeah, we haven't got the pieces yet. We haven't received the pieces yet. They're shipping them over to us. But when I do get them, it's going to be really funny to see because they're going to look terrible.
Hey, you know what? Lots of love, lots of blood, sweat, and tears probably went into it too.
No blood, thank goodness. Thank goodness. No injuries, no burns. A lot of sweat for sure, man. It is so hot, but it was cool.
I love that for you. I just went to a Pitbull T-Pain concert at Thunder Ridge, and I had the time of my life.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember like middle school, like
unfortunately, yes. Unfortunately, yes. Really glad like social media wasn't a huge thing at that time when I was in middle school. Like phones weren't out everywhere and everyone was recording everything, or there'd be some really humiliating videos of me like in middle school shaking my butt.
And thinking you were great at it?
Oh my goodness. Like thinking I was like,
cheek, right
I'm
cheek.
sexy. And meanwhile, I haven't kissed a boy in my life.
Yeah, right? Oh my gosh. It felt like I was back in middle school at homecoming, like in the gym, just dancing my heart out to T-Pain and Pitbull.
I love that for you.
It was so fun. So this episode is going to be a little less romantic, a little less fun, happy-go-lucky. We're going to talk about
it's going to be fun.
It's going to be fun for those who love nightmare reads and Stephen King.
Yes. That's me. Biggest smile on my face right now.
This is her episode.
I promise I'm not like a super dark, dreary kind of person, but if you are, that's okay. But I just love horror. I love mystery. I love thriller. I love Stephen King.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there's a reason why he is the king of horror.
He is.
And so today we're going to talk about Stephen King. We're going to talk about some horror books. And I want to kind of start off to let you know a little bit more about Stephen King. And I'll give you just kind of a little summary about his life and some of his works.
Mm-hmm.
He was born in Portland, Maine in 1947. And he made his first professional short story sale in 1967 to Startling Mystery Stories. Now, in 1971, he actually began teaching high school English class. How incredible would that be to be able to say that Stephen King was your high school English
I would
teacher?
literally die.
That's insane to think about. But he was writing in the evenings, and on weekends, he continued to write these short stories and novels. And then in 1973, Doubleday & Co. accepted his novel Carrie for
Mm-hmm.
publication. And of course, after that, he left teaching to write full time. Thank you, Stephen King, for doing that. But I'm sure you were an awesome English teacher.
I'm sure he was great.
But since then, he's published over 50 books and has become one of the world's most successful writers, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And he's the recipient of the 2003 National Book Foundation Medal for Distinguished Contribution to the American Letters and the 2014 National Medal of Arts. But I mean, on top of that, he's won countless of awards for his writing.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, also my favorite, his audiobooks.
Oh, yes.
And now he kind of bounces back from Maine and Florida. So he's basically a snowbird with his wife, who's also a novelist, Tabitha King.
Oh, yes. So a lot of his work has also been turned into movies too.
Mhm.
Everyone knows Carrie, It, The Shining, Pet Sematary.
Yeah, Cujo, Mr. Mercedes, and I heard just rumors online, maybe that one of his more recent ones, Fairy Tale, was picked up by a studio, but that was in like 2022, and I haven't been able to see much more on it since then. So we'll see if they end up making that, but I don't know why they wouldn't, because the books that they turn into movies are fairly successful.
Yeah,
I would
especially
say.
with today's technology, they could blow that out of the water.
Yeah, it's really cool. So my recent reads from Stephen King that I can talk a little bit more about today are Fairy Tale, and then also a book called The Institute.
Yes, you recently talked about that one.
Man, I loved that one.
Really?
I loved Fairy Tale too. I would definitely give both the 10 out of 10. But I did like The Institute maybe a little bit more. It is more of like a sci-fi thriller compared to Fairy Tale, which is obviously more fairy tale fantasy. Like, we'll say they both are extremely long books. The audiobooks, like we're pushing like the 24, 28 hour mark on the audiobooks, but I do, make them read a little bit faster.
Yeah,
than what they're
we know.
What are your recent reads or watches from Stephen King?
So I haven't really read anything recently by Stephen King, but I have read a lot of his novellas. So I haven't read like a full book of his, but I remember reading The Mangler in school when I told you I took like a horror and science fiction class.
Yeah.
The Mangler was one of our assignments, and I actually really enjoyed it. So it's basically about a detective who oversees a case of people dying in this laundromat. And this mangler machine ends up being like possessed and killing people. It's really interesting. Go read it if you haven't. Another one, obviously, The Mist was turned into a movie. It's actually a short story. Same with The Boogeyman. If you've ever seen The Boogeyman, or if you ever read The Boogeyman, you know of The Boogeyman. That's where Stephen King kind of gets that idea. And Big Driver was one that actually was kind of disturbing for me because I was like, this is too real. It's basically about a woman who has her tire blown out on the side of the road. A truck driver comes to stop and help her. Turns out that's her assailant who basically put out like tire spikes to catch her.
Ooh. Yikes.
Grapes her and then leaves her for dead. She somehow survives and then tries to get revenge on him and his entire family.
I hope she does.
Yes, it's disturbing, but I loved it. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good. It's dark.
He writes some dark things, obviously.
And that's what I have to talk about today in his fairy tale book, because I'll get more into that. But I will say it is not dark compared to your normal Stephen King.
Yes, I've heard it's actually on my TBR for myself because I'm not a super huge horror person, but I also found that was actually a really interesting read.
Yeah, so I'll just start diving into that. So it's kind of about this 17-year-old named Charlie Reed, and what happens is basically early on he rescues this elderly grouch of a neighbor he has who has this really cute dog who's a German Shepherd, I believe. And the elderly neighbor needs to go to the hospital for several days. So he starts to take care of the dog for him while he's in the hospital. And then he develops this strong relationship between the dog and between the old man. And it turns out that the old man has a portal to another world in his backyard.
That's not creepy at all.
Yeah. It's locked up and everything, but long story short, Charlie ends up, I'm not really spoiling anything, so don't worry. Charlie ends up taking a journey to this other world basically to save the dog, and he finds himself with the task in this new land of saving this new land from this blight that's taken over all good things in this other world and is slowly killing everyone there.
Oh.
So it is very good. Super long story, like I mentioned, but with that extended story, you really get this intense world building.
Okay.
And what is really important for the world building in this book is that it requires two separate world buildings. So you have, you know, our land, Earth, humankind as we think of it, that world building. And then you also have this fairy tale land world building that he has to do as well. So it's definitely a book that you need your brain for. And yeah, to definitely pay attention when you're getting all of these little details, because when you do, you can really visualize both of these lands very well. And the fairy tale land is certainly important to be able to visualize, because that might be a little bit harder than thinking about, you know, your everyday neighborhood.
That would make a great movie.
It would. It really would. It was such like a large journey that he ends up taking. But like I mentioned, people were surprised. Reviews from this book, it's definitely quote unquote wholesome for Stephen King. So definitely lighthearted than his books that are just, you know, horror, killing, revenge.
Better than a clown killing a bunch of kids.
Exactly. Like really, really dark. But you know, there's definitely some death. There's definitely mystery. And so I think it's certainly a good book for people who are like wanting to maybe change over to this genre, give Stephen King a chance, maybe just say you were able to read a Stephen King book.
Dip their toes in the water.
Exactly. This would certainly be that good book for it. If you're not used to kind of dark horror books. There's a little bit of murder, you know, but it takes you on a journey through this young boy's life and struggles. And there's a part in this book that I didn't really understand at first while I was reading it, for maybe the necessity of why it was included. But while I was researching Stephen King for this show and just kind of wanting to dive more into things about him, I learned that he is openly admits that he used to be an alcoholic.
Wow.
And is now sober now. And in the book, this young boy, Charlie, his dad at the beginning suffers with alcoholism and works through addiction and like turns his life around for him and his son. So I kind of like, I was like, that's interesting. It was an interesting aspect to put into the book. I was like, okay. And then after learning that, I was like, you know what? That's really cool that he was like, you know, I want to talk about this. So he put some of his life, I feel like, into his work, which was really neat.
That's really cool too. That's also something that I didn't know about him. So thank you for bringing those up. Did you have anything else by Stephen King that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah. So The Institute.
Okay.
Holy cow, guys.
What would you give it out of 5?
Out of 5, 6.
Wow.
7, 8, 9, 10.
Okay.
It is definitely darker than fairy tale. It has to do with children. And I will preface by saying that need a trigger warning here for those who've dealt with abuse, trauma, or have maybe PTSD, war PTSD by chance, because there is torture in this book as well. And it's also torturing children.
Ooh, that's rough.
Yeah. So that sounds really bad. I hope that doesn't put you off, but it's really, really good. So there's this child genius. His name is Luke Ellis, and he's actually abducted by a secret organization that uses these children's abilities to manipulate the world in their favor in the name of quote unquote keeping world peace, basically. So they're like keeping world peace by kidnapping these children and like frying their brains.
With like magical powers?
So the children are either telepathic or telekinetic. Those are only the children that they kidnap.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So he ends up making friends with all of these other children residents in the front half of this like torture place, basically. And then they're trying to plot their escape before they're sent to the back half, where they end up never seeing those children again. And so it's kind of a crazy story because it's certainly fiction, but you're also reading it and you're like, wait a second. honestly, this could totally happen.
Yeah.
Like, be happening right underneath our nose. Like, it's like a secret building in the middle of nowhere, and there is a town there, but they're like paying off the people of the town.
Could be like Area 51.
Yeah, exactly. Well, hopefully they're not torturing children there.
Well, we never know what the government's doing, so.
So it definitely has like this realistic factor. But once again, in the Stephen King fashion, incredible world building in this book. And not in like the way that we think of like current popular fantasy books, ACOTAR universe world building, but like the ability to create a world that you can put yourself in just like one book. Granted, his books are super long, but you're putting yourself into this world. And in this book, it's the real life world. But you know all of these characters, you know all of like their thoughts, their intricacies, and they have like personalities that you understand and some that you really even can empathize with. So I just love that that's how he kind of creates these characters. They're so complex, but he writes in a way that makes them understandable and relatable. And what I can also appreciate as an author is that the information that he puts in is correct. So, I mean, this man does his research on things, or at least his editors do. So when he means to be practical and accurate, he is. Don't, fact check me completely on that. I'm sure there's maybe some things in there in some of his books that maybe aren't so completely accurate, but his books are unique. They're thrilling. Some of them may give you nightmares, but they're just so dynamic. And he manages to tie all of these small plot lines together at the end of the book so seamlessly and answer all of these questions. So I just gave a TED Talk, but that is how I feel.
Hey, this is why Stephen King is the king of horror. Because he is really great at world building. And I like that you brought up that it's not like our fairy tale world building. World building does not have to mean fairy tale. It just means the details that the author puts in the book to make you feel like you are in that world.
And I mean, I think it can even be more difficult sometimes when this world you're in is just our regular everyday world, so you can picture yourself in their situation, or maybe you don't want to be like that. Maybe you want to just completely picture yourself as this child who's being taken and in this completely fairy tale as a book, in this completely like made up place. I was able to, when I was listening, I listen to audiobooks, when I was listening to this book, to think of all of these places and buildings, and I kid you not, they were buildings that I've never seen in my entire life. They were forests I've never seen in my entire life. I just made up in my head, was able to visualize all of these buildings that he was describing. And I think that's certainly a skill as an author to allow your readers to do.
Yeah, being able to write in that much detail so we can visualize every little thing is really good. So
makes it easier to read.
So that was Stephen King, obviously the king of horror. If you want to just kind of dip your toes in the world of horror and you don't want to go straight to It, The Shining,
Carrie,
all of the fun things, you could try Edgar Allan Poe. He's a dark poet. So I read like The Telltale Heart, The Black Cat. The Telltale Heart is about a man who can't stop hearing a heartbeat no matter what. He's driving himself crazy. Well, spoiler alert, it's because of the dead body that he buried underneath the floorboards, and the heart is beating, and it's like psychosis almost.
I read that one in school. I didn't remember though, but yes, you said that and I was like, wait a second, I've definitely read that one.
Yeah. And so it's just something fun to dip your toes in. Also, Dracula by Bram Stoker. It's not actually very lighthearted. It's actually very dark.
Yeah, I imagine.
And here's something fun. Grimm's Fairy Tales by the Brothers Grimm. If you're a Disney fan and you want to ruin your childhood.
No.
These fairy tales were published in 1812. They, Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood are a lot darker than you might think.
I remember being in school though, and people were talking about the Cinderella one where like one of the sisters, to try and fit into the shoe, like chops her toes off.
Yep. The stepsisters get their eyes pecked out by crows.
Wow.
Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf actually does eat grandma.
You know.
And yeah, there's a lot of murder and dark torture.
What about Sleeping Beauty?
There's a little bit of grape.
Oh, snap.
Not good.
Yikes.
So, yeah, that's just if you want to dip your toes in and ruin your childhood, I would read The Brothers Grimm.
Fun.
So fun. Anyways, if you want nightmares, this episode was for you. If you have any horror recommendations, do you have anything else, Danielle?
Any other recommendations? You know, not necessarily off the top of my head. Fairy tale for people who are dipping their toes into Stephen King, and then definitely The Institute for anyone and everyone.
There you go. Well, if you read these books, or if you have any recommendations you have for Danielle, because I probably will not read them, follow us on social media, Main Character Syndrome Pod. To the readers who listen, we'll see you later.
Bye, everyone.